broadcast of the online course, Catechism of the Orthodox Church out of the Old Testament. I'm Thomas Shaw, and today I want to talk about, as I mentioned yesterday, the historicity of the Torah, and particularly the book of Genesis, a quite controversial topic, especially since creationism seems to be on the rise in certain Christian circles, and this has affected many Orthodox believers as well. Now, in addition to having a theological education, I went to the theological school of the University of Thessaloniki and graduated in 1983, and then was a priest of the Greek Orthodox Diocese of San Francisco under His Eminence Metropolitan Anthony of blessed memory. Since that time, though, for the last 20 years, I've been working in the pharmaceutical sciences, writing scientific reports on human clinical trials of drugs. So for 20 years, I've been involved very intimately with the scientific method. And in fact, I've been what you might consider a gatekeeper of the scientific method. And in the process, I've had to learn a lot on the job, biology, statistics, and so forth as to how the scientific method works in order to disprove a hypothesis, because the scientific method generally can only disprove hypotheses and thus leave a narrative intact. Or if it does disprove a hypothesis, then the narrative that hypothesis is part of must be discarded and or fixed somehow. So the sciences are quite different than the Bible. As we mentioned over the last couple of days, the Bible's method of writing is rhetorical. It uses history and rhetorical literary devices in order to bring the reader or the hearer into a relationship, a confrontation with the theophany, which is to produce an ethical crisis leading to repentance and further deeper participation in the mysteries. This is not the purpose of science, obviously. The purpose of science is to try to ascertain facts, and on the basis of these facts, propose various narratives and hypotheses, which it attempts to disprove by statistical methodologies. So the sciences are generally to give a great preeminence to quantities. And these facts that are established by the scientific method are then strung together into narratives that produce new hypotheses that can be tested and by attempting to disprove them in further refinement of the narrative. So we have in the Bible, in the book of Genesis, we have some numbers, and these numbers are what cause a lot of the controversy. We have a chronology that goes back 4,000 or 5,000 BC, depending on whether you're reading in the Masoretic Hebrew text or the Septuagint, because the numbers are not the same between the two. And this is an important point, especially for us Orthodox who take the Septuagint as our text that we listen to in church. The thing we have to keep in mind about these numbers is they play a much bigger role, or a different role, in our modern post-Enlightenment mindset, where anything that's numerical is something you can really, as a fact, you can pin down. When in fact they were simply part of the rhetoric. If you go and study the various chronologies in the Bible, you come to realize that they're tailored to give an even number of years or thousands of years to various events. such as the founding of Solomon's temple, or the founding of the new temple, or the coming of the Messiah, or various other significant events in the history of Israel, are then seen to be some even number of years from then back to Adam. And so the numbers are part of the rhetorical structure of the Bible, and I don't think they are to be taken literally, and they certainly don't accord with the findings of modern science. And yet, the sequence of events I'm hoping to show today that's laid out in the Bible, we do find these do correspond to history as we currently understand it. As I said, the sciences are always evolving in the narrative that they're teaching, according to new facts that come to light, and thus the narrative isn't fixed as it is in the Bible. So turning to today's board, I've put up the sequence of events, major events in the Pentateuch, in the Torah, and I put up the sequence of events that relate to these in some way or another in history. Now, in the Bible, we have the sequence: creation, the beginning of agriculture. Remember that the curse on Adam was that he had to go out and farm before he was a gardener, or taking care of orchards. Then we go to cities. Remember that the cities in Genesis are first established by the descendants of Cain. This is an interesting fact because the Bible, the Old Testament, exhibits a lot of ambiguity about cities and civilization. It seems to have an element, and we'll get into this later, that there's a strong tradition of people who were wanderers or shepherds who lived outside the cities and looked on city life with skepticism. Then we have the flood, the Tower of Babel with the dispersion of the peoples and the languages. And then we come up to Abraham, and Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then Jacob's son Joseph goes into Egypt, and the rest of the brothers follow. They're there for some period of time. Then there's the Exodus, the wandering in the desert, and finally the entry into the Promised Land. Now, in history, what we have is about 60,000 years ago, we find the first cultural humans. By cultural humans, we mean humans that are producing art, because we have artistic artifacts. There are, of course, very famous caves that are found in Southern Europe. There's jewelry. There are signs of people using ochre to decorate their bodies and so forth. And so this is, and also the kind of technology changes when it comes to the stone tools that they're using. They're starting to use what are called microliths, which they've developed very an ability to produce very fine blades, not the cruder tools that characterize the early period. Now, this is deep in the Ice Age. Over the last 400,000 years or so, the Earth has cycled through 100,000-year ice ages, which are then punctuated by a 10 to 20,000 period, a year period of warmth, and then plunges into another ice age. So humans came into being cultural in the middle of the Ice Age. And then the Ice Age reached its maximum, I think around 25,000 years ago, something like that. And then it began to melt and break up around 18,000 years ago. And then about 12,000 years ago, we start to see periods, the period that we're in, which is a sustained warm climate. By warm climate, we mean now the parts of the northern hemisphere that were covered in ice sheets, all those ice sheets have retracted, and these lands become temperate and available for the development of new ecologies and places where humans can move into. So at the beginning of the Holocene, we have the beginning of horticulture, agriculture, and domesticated animals. And we can see this corresponds to the garden phase, the garden and the fall. And the domestication of animals doesn't really enter in the Bible, but this is all part of the picture that comes into the development of cities and temples. In fact, the oldest temple is about 10,000 years old, is Göbekli Tepe, which is found very close to the traditional homeland of Abraham, just north of Haran, near the city of Sanliurfa in Turkey. And this is a fantastic site of round temples that have T-shaped pillars with very fine and beautiful engravings of the animals that were in the area. And these were used for a period of time, then they were buried, and they make another temple on top. And there is a whole hill that they've been excavating for like the last 15 years that's full of these temples. And there seems to be other ones around too. So this is a whole new area of discovering this type of monumental architecture among people who weren't even quite settled down yet. They weren't really farmers. They were still hunter-gatherers. Because in this period, in the area of northern Syria and southern Turkey, was still quite lush and green from the receding ice age. And there were animals. It was like the Serengeti. There were animals that would traverse through on great migrations, and these were great hunting grounds in this area. And it is in this area, at the headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which are almost together in southern southeast Turkey, that the Bible identifies the location of Eden. So the Bible correctly identifies where agriculture begins. And also that the first cities. Now, the first cities then weren't like cities today. They were more like hives. They didn't have streets. They were more like apartments that you entered through the ceiling. And when you were done after a period of time, you would collapse that and build another house on top of it. So we have all these layers that they've gone through. And you would bury the dead in the floor. And perhaps this was due to the fact that still in this period, there were megafauna, what we call megafauna, huge animals that were around and were threatening to humans. Now, with the beginning of the Holocene, for some reason unknown to science, almost all of these huge animals go into extinction. So then there's a period of some time while humans develop out of the local plants and animals of the area from southern Turkey down into present-day Israel. They start domesticating many plants, and of course the principal animals are the sheep and the goats. Cattle come much later, and they begin developing the idea of a manor culture, a farming culture, where you have a plot of land upon which, with these plants and animals, you can sustain a family for a complete lifetime. You have everything you need on site. This is the famous family farm. This idea kept going until recent years, as we saw in the United States. The same thing happened. The dispersion of agriculture was by people taking a really movable human technology of an ecosystem, we could say, everything humans would need, and that the animals that they would need, to live on a farm, and they began radiating out from this area of eastern Turkey that's called Anatolia, and they radiated out to all the world. So for the first couple of thousand years, though, after the discovery of agriculture, we find that humans are shorter and they have many diseases because they hadn't domesticated enough products to have a balanced diet. And in the Bible, we read that Adam has the curse on Adam in the Bible, contrast to some theologies, is that the land will be cursed. And this curse on the land is lifted with the flood. And we see this in the bones of people over that as the package of foodstuffs become broader and people are having a better diet, their health improves. Now, around this time, there was cities can start. Cities are known for going out and exploiting the local forests, which can lead to flooding because the soil is denuded, rains come and can bring flooding. And there are reports of flooding all through the earth. Of all peoples everywhere talk about the flooding. Well, part of the flooding was that as the ice sheets melted, the sea level rose, and they also put a lot more water into the system, and whole new lakes developed. There was a lot, so you could find yourself subject to periodic flooding of just about anywhere you were in the world. One of the theories about the flood that's in the Bible, and I put this date here, 5600 BC, is that this was that the freshwater glacial melt Black Sea became part of the ocean by the Aegean Sea breaking through the Bosphorus and flooding it. This theory, of course, is disputed by other scientists because this is science. The theories aren't settled. But we do know that, in fact, this incursion, this change did take place about this time of the Black Sea from being fresh water to salt water. Now, one of the things the biblical authors are doing, and I want to use the flood as an illustration of that, but we could use this for almost any of these stories, is they're demythologizing the history and science that they've received from the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians. And a good example of this is the story of the flood. Now, the Mesopotamians were living in Iraq. They were going up into the forests and cutting the trees, and they had these problems of periodic devastating floods wiping out their cities. And so they had a reason to tell stories about floods. And one of the stories they tell is that the god El, remember we talked the other day about the three Mesopotamian gods, El, Anu, and Enki, El being the god of the north, Enki being the god of the south, the god of the deep, the god of fresh water. And El is the high god, and he gets angry in the Mesopotamian version of the flood because humans are making so much noise having sex, and he's had it. He's going to shut down. He's had it with humanity. Well, what Enki gets word of what El's plan is, and Enki goes and tells the Noah equivalent in the story. He has another name. It's a long Mesopotamian name. And he tells this person to build an ark in order to save himself and his family. So what we have here is a demythologizing of the story. Because instead of there being two characters, there's only one character, one God. There's one God, and he's both the God that's angry and the God that saves. Whereas and so we have this, odd schizophrenia in the story, let's say. God's really mad at humanity. He's going to destroy humans off the face of the earth, not because they're having so much noise in sex, but because they're committing all kinds of crimes. And he informs Noah to save humanity at the same time he's destroying humanity. The story makes sense if you understand the background story, that the point of the story is about God, that God, there's one God who's both the destroyer and the creator. And in the story of Babel, also is something that's true in a way, because this out of this one spot on Earth, the area of, around Göbekli Tepe, because from there you can see the mountain where they have found the wheat that became domesticated wheat in its wild form. It's still growing there. From these packages, these farms, this farm life, these people began to disperse throughout the world. And as they dispersed, they would displace the hunter-gatherers who were living in other places, often intermarrying, probably killing the men and taking the wives, a pattern we see in parts of the biblical history. And so there's intermarriage, but the culture and the language is evolving as well. So out of one language and one culture in Anatolia, agriculture radiates throughout the world. And this process continued right here in the United States, where, this wave finally bumped up on these shores with the Pilgrims and with the English colonies in Virginia, and the same process. Before, there are people who were living here who had no concept of the ownership of private property, and we Americans, our ancestors, started fencing off the land, cutting down the trees, and establishing farms, marching across the continent. This is the same thing that happened in Europe, but it happened, 7,000 BC, something like that. So around 3,500 BC, then we get to the Bronze Age, and the Bible moves pretty quickly to Abraham, and Abraham's time corresponds with what we might call the Middle Bronze Age, which starts around 2000 BC. And Abraham comes out of the country of the Hurrians and the Mitanni. Now, these were people, the indigenous people that were still living in the place where agriculture developed, and they were still speaking a very ancient language unrelated to any other language. But in the meantime, up north of the Black Sea, the first Indo-Europeans were developing a horse and wheel culture, and they began moving into south of the Black Sea, and they took over this area with an Indo-European, it seems, elite class, and a Hurrian-speaking lower class. And so it's in this country, in this time frame, that Abraham comes. And he moves south with his family through Canaan, and God promises them the land of Canaan. Now, what is Canaan? Canaan is defined in the Bible as pretty much the same as modern Israel and Lebanon, a little bit more to the east, but not much. So Canaan was the land promised to Abraham and his descendants. And Abraham's descendants then end up, according to the Bible, in Egypt as slaves. Now, what history doesn't really record this anywhere, this event. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. What it does record is there were some people called the Habiru who were, a lot of people try to connect to the Hebrews. I'm pretty doubtful about this. These people were kind of the brigands and people living outside of the cities. And I mentioned that there is this cultural element. So some elements of Israelite tradition perhaps come out from these Habiru people, and of course the name is similar to Hebrew. But Hebrew is a Canaanite language, and we don't know what language the Habiru taught. talked, but all of the countries have records of these people and what a problem they were. Now, around 1500 BC, then, some of these Canaanites, linking up with some of these chariot drivers, are able to take over Egypt. And so Egypt, Canaan, we have to realize, was always disputed. Sometimes it was under Mesopotamian influence, sometimes it was under Egyptian influence. This is part of the reason why we have to look at both influences when we study the Bible. So the Canaanites, who are not the Israelites, even though they speak similar languages, but languages, don't necessarily indicate ethnicity at all. As we know here in the United States, most everybody speaks English, and yet we're of many different ethnicities, and languages move around in a way that people don't. So the Canaanites were, in the Bible times, are known as, the term Canaanite is used, but mainly for Phoenicians who are not living in Phoenicia, or living in the Promised Land, and need to be dealt with. Now, the Phoenicians were living, this is later in the Iron Age, but I'm jumping ahead, because the name Canaan and the name Phoenicia are the same word. They both refer to purple. They refer to this, the color purple, which isn't our purple. If you're familiar with the color purplish burgundy color, maroon color that's in Byzantine icons, this is the color we're talking about, not our modern purple. And this, the dye that was created from certain kinds of shellfish, that they use these shellfish to produce a dye, and this dye was very valuable and famous and made Phoenicia rich and made it a major force. Well, this went back into the Bronze Age, so Canaan and Phoenicia are two words for the same thing. Now, after the Hyksos are driven out back into Canaan, and they had some very significant cities there that we've found their remains. After that, then we have this odd event in Egyptian history of the pharaoh Akhenaten. Akhenaten, outside the Bible, is the first known monotheist. Akhenaten taught that the sun disk, not the sun god, of Egyptian mythology, Ra or Re, depending on how you see it written. This isn't the God he's referring to. He's referring to the actual sun. He says the sun itself is the only God. And this will, when we discuss God's glory, I'll get into more details about Akhenaten. But this is our first record in history of the idea of there only being one God. And then around the same time, between Akhenaten and the collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations, there are records of people who are living in the area where the Israelites were wandering, according to the Bible, and they're called Shisu or Shu. These are various wandering tribes, and they all have different names, and perhaps those names are after some significant cultural artifact of theirs. And one of them, tellingly, is Shishu or Shu, YHW, which is very similar to the divine name. So, and we also find at the beginnings of some inscriptions in Midian and so forth, which is on the other side of the Red Sea in the Arabian Peninsula, south of Edom. we start seeing some records of a god named Yah at this period as well. And Yah shows up in the Bible and is similar, obviously, in letters. And finally, in 1200 BC, we have the collapse of civilization. During the late Bronze Age, they developed a very sophisticated international civilization. And there were a lot of trade, and it was a great going concern. But it seems that they became weak in their defenses, and a lot of their mercenary armies that were designed to keep the barbarians out turned on the capital cities. Or there are various theories, and you can read about. It's still not quite clear why civilization collapsed, but all at once, over a period of maybe 50 years, all these major cities in the Near East are burnt to the ground, and hordes come in, and new people come in, and this is the beginning of the Iron Age. And at this time in Canaan, they're writing letters, which we have, saying that the barbarians are coming over the Jordan, and they're about to invade. And it's around this time that the cities mentioned in the Bible that the Israelites were building were prominent cities in Egypt, city of Ramses. So this could align then with the entry into the Promised Land. And in fact, in archaeology around this time, after the collapse of civilization, we find in the Bible lands the arrival of a new people archaeologically, and there are people who do not eat pork, and this is one of their distinguishing characteristics. So Israeli archaeologists are pretty confident that 1200 BC is the beginning of anything that we might call verifiable archaeology of the Israelite people in the Promised Land. Now, this was just a very brief review of prehistory. Prehistory is a very complicated, interesting field that's been developing new ideas and new theories and new facts over the last 10 or 20 years. There's been a real outburst of new information. Unfortunately, a lot of that new information isn't forthcoming anymore because many of the digs in this area have had to be abandoned because of war in Iraq and Syria and so forth. But I hope I've succeeded in my main point of pointing out that even though the chronology does not match in the Bible, that the sequence of events leading up to the entry of the Israelites in the Promised Land and the beginning of the times accounted for in the book of Judges, Joshua and Judges, are this all begins right here, and that the sequence it matches, can be fit into the sequence of history is understood by modern historians. So that's it for today. I hope your Lent is still going well, and we will meet again tomorrow at 3 o'clock local time here in Colorado. I'm really enjoying doing this series, and I hope you're equally enjoying hearing it. And please don't hesitate to ask me any questions on my YouTube page. I have a corresponding Facebook page with the same name as my YouTube page. Please like it. You can ask me questions there as well. I post the videos there every day. Thank you so much for your time, and I'll see you tomorrow.